Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey drifts into one of the oldest questions humans have ever asked. What animates a living body? What leaves when life fades? And whether anything in science or philosophy can truly point towards something we might call the soul. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you enjoy these gentle explorations. And when you're ready, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting to imagine people scattered across the world, each in their own quiet space, joining the same soft conversation. Now, dim the lights if you'd like, find a comfortable position, maybe let the air settle around you, and if your mind wanders at any point, let it drift. We'll still be here, slowly unfolding the story. This evening, we explore two scientific claims that recently spread across the internet. One about a tiny burst of light when a sperm touches an egg, and another about a final surge of brain activity after the heart and lungs have stopped. Some say these flashes and spikes are signs of the soul entering and leaving the body. Others say they are simply biological processes misunderstood. What we'll do tonight is not argue, but wander through the science carefully, gently, and then let the deeper philosophical questions rise on their own, like lanterns floating upward into a calm night sky. Human beings have always wondered what makes us alive. You can feel your pulse, you can sense your breath, you can watch your hands move when you decide to move them. But underneath all of this, there is something quieter, something that feels like it does the experiencing, the choosing, the remembering. For thousands of years, people called it the soul, or the inner self, or the spark of consciousness. And even now, in an age of microscopes and satellites, the question has not gone away. It may have grown even more intriguing. Tonight we take the first step into the topic by looking at why humans search for evidence of something beyond the physical. It is not just curiosity, it is the sense that there is more to being alive than biochemical reactions and electrical signals. When you listen to a piece of music or recognize the warmth of a familiar voice, it feels different from molecules bouncing around. Something invisible seems to be involved, something that cannot be held in your hand or described by weight and shape alone. And when life ends, the absence of this invisible something feels unmistakable. This desire to understand what that something is has traveled through every culture. Some traditions speak of breath as life, others speak of light, others of an unchanging essence that sits quietly behind the shifting thoughts and emotions of a lifetime. Modern science approaches the question from a different direction, studying the brain, the body, the moment life begins and the moment it ends. Yet the puzzle remains unsolved. Recently, two scientific stories reignited this age-old question. The first story tells of a small flash of light at the moment an egg is activated, something researchers captured with extremely sensitive imaging. The second story describes a final wave of fast brain activity appearing just after the heart and lungs have stopped. Both stories spread quickly across the world. People began saying scientists had finally captured the soul, entering the body and then leaving it again at the end. These claims were exciting, dramatic, and a little haunting, but they also raised a deeper point. If the soul exists, could science ever detect it? Or is the very nature of the soul beyond the reach of the instruments we build? Before we explore the details of these two stories, it helps to understand why such claims feel powerful. Whenever life begins, a child conceived, a seed germinating, there is something mysterious about the transition from non-living to living, and when life ends, especially quietly and peacefully, there is a sense of something slipping away, not with noise but with a kind of stillness. These moments affect us in ways that data alone cannot describe. We look for meaning in them because they feel meaningful long before any theory can explain them. The scientific world tries to understand such moments by studying the physical events involved. When an egg is touched by a sperm cell, a cascade of microscopic changes begins, changes that happened so quickly and delicately they were invisible until recently. Similarly, when the body is shutting down, the brain does not go dark instantly. It follows its own steps, some of which we're only now beginning to see. These processes are fascinating enough on their own, even without any connection to the soul. But for many, the scientific details hint at something more. A light at the start of life feels symbolic. A final burst at the end feels poetic, and humans naturally try to turn symbolism into explanation. Part of tonight's journey is to consider these interpretations gently and ask what science truly shows. But another part is to understand the limitations of science, not in a dismissive way, but in a humble one. Scientific instruments measure things that have size, shape, energy, charge, or movement. If the soul is not that kind of thing, if it is something that does not occupy physical space or emit physical forces, then expecting a microscope or sensor to detect it may be like expecting a thermometer to measure music. This does not mean the soul isn't real. It only means the tools of science might not be built for this particular question. Science is extraordinarily powerful, but it is designed to study what lies inside the fabric of space, time, and matter. If consciousness or the soul exists outside that framework, it may be known only through its effects, not its presence. As we begin this exploration, it helps to remember that questions about the soul have never been answered quickly. They require a soft mindset, one that accepts uncertainty without fear. Tonight we will look at biology, physics, philosophy, and ancient wisdom. Each one offers a different kind of lantern in the dark. None of them may reveal the entire landscape, but together they illuminate a path. And on that path, perhaps we can understand why people see sparks, spikes, and storms of activity and think, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the moment the soul arrives or departs. For many people, the first story in our journey begins with a single frame of video. In 2011, a group of researchers at Northwestern University pointed exquisitely sensitive cameras at a mammalian egg at the very moment it was touched by a sperm cell. They were not searching for anything mystical. They were studying how early life awakens, how an egg knows it has been activated, and what biochemical sequence begins the long road toward development. But when they slowed down the footage, something unexpected appeared. Just after the sperm made contact, a tiny flash shimmered across the surface of the egg, so small that no human eye could have seen it without the help of this technology. It looked like a brief burst of starlight in a microscopic sky. The video spread across the internet with astonishing speed. People saw the flash and immediately began weaving meaning into it. Some said it was the moment the soul entered the body. Some said science had finally captured proof of an ancient belief. Others felt a quiet wonder, the way you might feel when watching a sunrise, even if you don't know exactly why it moves you. Something about a light at the beginning of life felt symbolic, poetic, and strangely familiar. What the researchers saw, however, was not a mystical event but a chemical one, though no less beautiful. When the sperm touches the egg, it delivers a small protein messenger. In scientific language, that messenger is called phospholipase C-zeta, but we don't need the long name here. You can simply imagine it as a gentle tap on the shoulder, a signal that says, it's time to wake up. This signal starts a wave inside the egg, like the slow spreading of warmth through water, and as this wave moves, the egg opens small gates near its surface, releasing thousands upon thousands of tiny zinc particles into the surrounding fluid. Zinc is a quiet element in the body, part of many enzymes and processes, almost never seen directly. But in this moment it becomes visible, not because it glows on its own, but because the researchers used a kind of microscopic lantern, fluorescent imaging, that turns the movement of zinc into a soft, shimmering outline. When the zinc rushes outward, the camera sees it as a quick flash, as if the egg were breathing out a sigh of light. What makes this discovery especially fascinating is that it happens not only in humans, but in other species as well. Mice, monkeys, even buffalo. The same light, the same rush of zinc, the same soft shimmer. If we were to interpret the flash as the arrival of a soul, we would need to ask what this means for all the creatures that share the same spark. And in some traditions, that question leads to a larger idea, that every living being, from the simplest to the most complex, carries a kind of inner essence. In others, it suggests the spark is not a soul but simply the language of biology speaking through light. To truly understand the flash, the researchers did something clever. They tried to see if the egg would produce the same burst even if no sperm were present, and with the help of a simple laboratory compound, they nudged the egg gently, imitating the signal normally delivered by the sperm. The result was the same. The zinc moved outward, the surface shimmered, and the egg responded as if it had been awakened. There was no sperm, no fusion, no DNA exchange, only a chemical push. Yet the light still appeared. This finding was important. It showed the spark was not a soul choosing a home, nor a spiritual fire igniting. It was the egg itself responding to a shift in its own chemistry. The light was a sign that the egg had begun the long journey of cell division, that the machinery of life was turning on. It was a fingerprint of activation, a symbol of readiness, but not a metaphysical arrival. Still, even with this explanation, something about the image lingers. There is a quiet beauty in the idea that at the moment life awakens, there is a visible sign, even if it is a biochemical sign. Light has carried symbolism for as long as humans have told stories. We are drawn to the soft glow of candles, the gleam of stars, the warmth of lanterns, and when we see light where we expect none, our minds leap toward meaning. The key is understanding that meaning does not have to rely on misinterpretation. The zinc spark is not proof of a soul entering the body, but it is a reminder that the beginning of life is a moment filled with delicate transformations. Even the smallest chemical shift becomes part of a larger choreography. A single signal sets off a cascade becomes a pattern, and that pattern becomes a living being who may one day wonder about its own origin. Science offers us a gentle way to reinterpret the flash. Instead of seeing it as a cosmic arrival, we can see it as a door opening, a quiet mechanical click that allows everything else to follow. In that sense, the spark is still meaningful. It marks the transition from stillness to motion, from waiting to becoming, from potential to unfolding. A soul, if one exists, may not be made of zinc or light, but it may find its home in a body that has just awakened with such a breath. Sometimes people worry that explaining a phenomenon removes its magic, but here the explanation adds its own kind of wonder. Imagine trillions of eggs across time, each one carrying the ability to ignite with a shimmer when touched by the right signal. Imagine the light that flickers for an instant, unseen by any eye, but captured now by instruments sensitive enough to translate chemistry into a moment of beauty. The sparkle is not the soul, but it is a sign that the world is capable of surprising us even in its smallest corners. As we drift further into this exploration, the spark becomes a gentle reminder. The beginnings of life are intricate, precise, and astonishing. They are not diminished by understanding, they are deepened by it. And the search for the soul does not disappear just because one symbol turns out to have a physical cause. Instead, it nudges us to look elsewhere, to more subtle places, and to questions that cannot be answered by light alone. There is something strangely poetic about the idea that just as life begins with a shimmer, it might also end with a final surge of brightness inside the brain. The second story that captured the world's imagination comes from a very different setting. Not a laboratory observing the beginning of life, but a quiet hospital room where life is gently slipping away. In 2025, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist known for exploring the borderlands between consciousness and the physical brain, monitored the brain activity of 7 patients as they approached the final stages of life support. He was not searching for the soul, he was studying the transition between consciousness and unconsciousness, hoping to better understand how awareness fades. What he saw surprised him. After each patient's heart stopped, after their lungs no longer moved, and after their pulse monitors had fallen into flat lines, the brain showed a sudden rise in high-frequency activity. In scientific language, this activity is called gamma, the fastest type of brain rhythm. But rather than using the technical term, it might be easier to imagine it as a brief shimmer, like a final sparkler fizzing in the darkness before going out completely. These waves are usually associated with focused attention, moments of clarity, or the brain's effort to integrate information. Yet here they were appearing at a time when consciousness was not expected at all. The findings startled scientists and laypeople alike. Images of the soul rising from the body have lived in human culture for centuries, and this little surge seemed to echo that old story. News outlets wrote headlines claiming scientists had detected the soul's departure, comment sections filled with wonder, fear, and curiosity. But to understand this event properly, we must step quietly into what the brain is doing in those final moments. Even though the heart and lungs stop first, the brain does not lose all activity instantly. It continues for a short while, fed by whatever trace oxygen and energy remain. When these reserves run out, its electrical currents fade like light bulbs dimming as a generator slows. But the brain is not a machine that simply shuts down. It is a living network, and networks often show complex behaviors when they collapse. Sometimes they release a last burst of coordinated activity as the connections loosen. Think of a city after a power outage, where the last echo of electricity flickers through the grid before disappearing. In these patients, the gamma activity appeared as a wave flowing across parts of the brain that, in life, are associated with memory, inner imagery, and awareness. Whether the patients experienced anything during this burst is unknown. They could not tell anyone, and the moment passed quickly. Some neuroscientists suggested that the surge might be the brain's final attempt to synchronize its fading circuits. Others argued that it might reflect the release of energy built up before the shutdown. But Dr. Hameroff, drawing on his long interest in consciousness and quantum-level effects inside neurons, wondered if this activity might represent something more, perhaps a transition of consciousness away from the physical body. Quantum theories of consciousness are often described with intimidating language, but we can soften them into something more approachable. Some scientists have suggested that inside the cells of the brain, in structures far smaller than any microscope can easily see, tiny patterns may form that store information in a way that is not fully tied to the physical world. They imagine these patterns as little pockets of organized energy, capable of holding a sense of self. If such pockets exist, then the final gamma wave could be a sign of these patterns loosening or dispersing, like a handful of glowing dust drifting into the air when a lantern breaks. This interpretation is not proven. It may never be proven in the traditional sense because it depends on things too small and too delicate to measure directly with the tools we have today. Yet it is a possibility, and one that aligns with how many cultures understand the departure of the soul. A last moment of brightness, a release, a quiet leaving. What is important is not whether the gamma burst is the soul escaping the body, but what the burst means for the larger conversation. It reminds us that consciousness is not as simple as flipping a switch. There are layers of activity, some that appear only at the edges of life. These layers might carry memories, feelings, or a sense of presence, echoes of all we have been, or they might simply be the brain rewiring itself in its final seconds, attempting to make sense of fading signals. The mystery remains, because each interpretation carries its own kind of beauty, and each one touches on the same quiet truth. We do not yet know what consciousness truly is. When people hear about the final surge, they often feel something stirring inside, the same feeling that accompanies a powerful piece of music or a meaningful dream. It is the sense that there might be something more happening in the mind than electrical pulses alone. And perhaps that feeling is worth listening to. Science can tell us what happens inside neurons, but it cannot yet tell us why experience feels the way it does. It cannot explain why a memory makes your chest tighten, or why a moment of gratitude feels warm, or why the thought of losing someone feels like a weight in the heart. These things are real, but they do not appear on monitors. So as we reflect on the bright surge at the edge of life, we can treat it gently. We can hold it the same way we hold the spark at the beginning of life, not as evidence of the soul, not as proof of its absence, but as a soft reminder that life is filled with transitions we do not fully understand. A surge of light at the start, a surge of light at the end, and a long unspoken journey in between. Whether that journey belongs only to biology or to something deeper is the question that leads us onward, quietly, slowly, toward the next part of this exploration. Before we move further into questions of the soul and the meaning of sparks and surges, it helps to pause and truly understand what unfolds in the quiet interior of an egg when it is touched by a sperm cell. This is one of the most delicate events in nature, and scientists have spent decades trying to capture its earliest moments. Not because they are searching for spiritual truths, but because the beginning of life is a piece of choreography so intricate that every new detail feels like discovering a hidden brushstroke in a painting. When a sperm approaches an egg, it does not immediately merge. There is a gentle preparation, a kind of introductory dance. Proteins on the sperm's surface interact with receptors on the egg, making sure the two are compatible. You can think of this as a small handshake, one that conveys not words but recognition. If the handshake is accepted, the sperm moves inward, bringing with it not just its genetic information, but a small biochemical message that awakens the egg. In biological language, this awakening begins with a tiny activator, a protein carried by the sperm. Scientists call this protein phospholipase C-zeta, but you can imagine it simply as a key, one that unlocks the egg from the inside. The moment the key is turned, the egg responds with a wave, an internal ripple that flows across its watery interior. This is not a wave of water, but a wave of signals, much like a soft glow spreading through frosted glass. As this wave travels outward, it reaches the surface of the egg, which has been patiently holding a reservoir of small zinc particles. These zinc particles play an important role in keeping the egg in a resting state, a state of waiting. When the wave reaches them, they are released. Billions of tiny particles, each one like a grain of dust too small to see, begin to move outward into the fluid around the egg. The researchers who study this process use fluorescent markers, gentle dyes that respond to the movement of zinc by glowing faintly, and with this, the outward rush appears as a momentary flash. It might help to imagine a snow globe. For a long moment, the snow inside is completely still. Then someone taps the globe gently, and all the flakes rise together before drifting outward. The zinc spark is much faster, much smaller, and much more fleeting, but the image is not so different. A stillness disturbed, a tiny storm created, and a shimmer appearing where there was none. What makes the zinc spark truly fascinating is that it isn't unique to humans. Mice show it, monkeys show it, buffalo show it. Any mammal with eggs that can be activated tends to produce this quiet flash. It is, in essence, the universal language of awakening among many species. And this universality tells us something important. The flash is not a signal of a soul choosing a place to enter, but a sign that the machinery of life is starting to turn. It also tells us something about how life protects itself. The zinc spark does more than shimmer. It helps seal the egg so that no other sperm can enter. Without this step, the egg could be overwhelmed by multiple genetic inputs at once, creating chaos. The spark is the egg's way of saying, "Enough, I am awake, I am beginning." There is a certain poetry in this, even if it is all chemistry. The researchers at Northwestern, led by Professor Teresa Woodruff, followed this spark with careful attention. They found that eggs with stronger, brighter zinc sparks tended to be more viable, more likely to begin dividing, more likely to continue developing. In this sense, the spark is a sign of readiness, a soft announcement that the egg has the energy and health to embark on the long road toward forming a new being. This leads to a deeper question. Why does this moment feel symbolic, even when we know the scientific explanation? Perhaps it is because the beginning of life carries its own gravity. Whether one believes in a soul or sees life as an emergent property of chemistry, the transition from stillness to becoming is profound. A flash in the darkness evokes stories, memories, and myths of creation. It resonates with something in the human heart that longs to understand where we come from. But understanding the zinc spark also removes a layer of confusion. It allows us to separate symbolism from mechanism. The spark is not a soul entering the body. It is not an otherworldly flame illuminated by a spiritual presence. It is the egg performing a task it has evolved to perform, protecting itself, awakening, and preparing for what comes next. The beauty of this moment remains, but its meaning shifts. Rather than a metaphysical arrival, it becomes a celebration of biological precision. Yet the spark still opens the door to deeper reflection. If life begins with such a carefully orchestrated pattern, what else might be organized with the same delicacy? Does consciousness itself arise from cascades of signals, waves, and flows like these? Or is there something layered on top of the chemistry, something that cannot be reduced to particles and waves alone? These questions do not need answers right away. They can sit quietly, the way a seed sits in dark soil before sprouting. For now, it is enough to see the spark for what it is, a glimpse into the complexity of life, a window into the precision beneath our existence, and a reminder that even the most ordinary biological processes can look extraordinary when viewed through the right lens. As we continue gently through this exploration, we will move from the spark itself to what it is not. We will look at how scientists tested its meaning, how they learned that this shimmer can appear even when no sperm is present, and how these insights shift the conversation from "what is this light?" to "what does this light tell us about the deeper mystery of being alive?" As we continue to wander through the story of the zinc spark, it becomes clear that what makes this phenomenon so fascinating is not just the light itself, but the way it behaves when the egg is awakened by something other than a sperm. The moment of fertilization is usually imagined as a meeting of two halves, a union that sets life in motion. But scientists discovered something surprising. The egg can shimmer even without a sperm cell. It can glow when nudged by a simple chemical signal. And this discovery quietly reshaped the conversation about what the spark truly means. To understand this, imagine again the egg as a room filled with silent instruments. The sperm arrives carrying a small key that unlocks the lights, the heating system, and the long corridors of activity. But the instruments inside the room do not know whether the signal came from a person or a gust of wind. They only know that something has pressed the switch. The egg is similar. It does not require the unique presence of a sperm. It only requires the internal signal that says, it's time to begin. Scientists tested this idea using a gentle chemical compound, often written as a tidy string of letters in research papers. Instead of overwhelming the egg, they used just enough of this compound to mimic the awakening signal normally delivered by the sperm. When it touched the surface, something remarkable happened. The egg responded exactly as it does during fertilization. The internal wave stirred to life. The zinc gathered near the membrane, and the small flash appeared. A tiny celebration of activation happening without any fusion of genetic material. This detail is simple, yet profound. If the spark were the soul entering the body, then a soul would be arriving whenever the egg responded to the chemical signal, even though no new life is actually formed. No embryo develops, no combining of two genetic codes takes place. Yet the shimmer still appears as automatically and as beautifully as before. The egg reacts not to meaning, but to chemistry. It does not interpret. It does not symbolically gesture. It simply wakes up. In the lab, researchers watched eggs begin their first divisions after this artificial activation. Some split once, others twice, like small clocks beginning to tick even though no real embryo would emerge. Without the necessary pairing of maternal and paternal DNA, the process eventually stops, but not before giving us a clearer picture of what the spark represents. It is the egg shifting out of rest, like a machine turning on even if no one is present to guide it. This finding may sound clinical, but it actually adds a deeper layer of wonder. Life is often thought of as something fragile, something that must be coaxed and protected. But here, the egg shows a readiness that is almost eager. It holds within itself the potential for motion, the ability to respond, the inclination to begin. Something inside is waiting, tuned to detect the smallest whisper of a signal. And when that whisper arrives, from a sperm, from a chemical, from any trigger that touches the right switch, the egg opens its gates and lets its stored zinc drift outward. Knowing that the spark does not require a sperm allows us to step back and understand why the image of light at fertilization seemed so compelling at first. Humans are naturally moved by symbolism. A burst of brightness at the start of life feels meaningful, even sacred. But nature often creates beauty through mechanisms that are neither mystical nor intentional. Snowflakes form perfect patterns because of how water molecules align when they freeze. Rainbows appear not because the sky is trying to impress us, but because light bends through droplets in a predictable way. The zinc spark belongs to this family of natural beauty, unexpected, delicate, and full of meaning only because we are the ones looking. When we view the spark as a biochemical event, we do not take away the possibility of the soul. Instead, we free the soul from being tied to a physical flash. We let it exist where it always has, in experience, in presence, in consciousness, not in a moment of glowing particles. The soul, if it exists, does not need a light show to announce itself. There's also a deeper question that emerges from this discovery. If the spark is not the soul, why do we want it to be? Why do we feel drawn to connect illumination with spiritual arrival? Perhaps it is because humans have always used light as a symbol of beginnings. A candle is lit to mark a prayer. A lamp is placed in a window to welcome someone home. Even in newborns, the first opening of the eyes feels like a tiny dawn. So a light appearing at the start of life feels like a sign, even when it is simply chemistry speaking in the only language it knows. Understanding this frees us to appreciate the spark for what it truly is. A biological message, a protective mechanism, a necessary foundation for life to proceed. It also encourages us to look elsewhere for the soul, if the soul is what we seek. Instead of searching for it in bright flashes or chemical storms, we can look for it in the experiences we cannot explain. The sudden flood of love when holding a newborn, the ache of memory, the quiet presence of awareness that remains through every moment of change. As we continue our exploration, the spark becomes a helpful guide. It tells us that not everything beautiful is mystical, and not everything mysterious is a sign of the soul. But it also nudges us toward another realization. If the beginning of life carries this much complexity and beauty, without invoking the soul, then perhaps the soul's presence, if it exists, must be found in a different dimension altogether. One that is softer, quieter, and woven into consciousness itself, rather than into the mechanics of cell activation. And so, the spark is both an answer and an invitation. It answers the question of whether the soul arrives with a flash of light. It invites us to search deeper, beyond shimmer and glow, into the inner landscape where awareness, memory, and existence unfold. As we drift deeper into this quiet exploration, the zinc spark begins to settle into its proper place, not as the arrival of something spiritual, but as the beginning of a physical process that prepares the egg for what comes next. And yet, the spark leaves behind a question more delicate than the shimmer itself. If the light at fertilization is not the soul entering the body, why did so many people feel drawn to that interpretation? Why did something so tiny and chemical resonate as though it were telling a larger story? Part of the answer lies in the way humans understand beginnings. We often interpret the world through symbols. A sunrise is more than the movement of the earth, a wedding ring is more than metal, a lullaby is more than sound. We wrap meaning around events not because the events demand it, but because we long for meaning in the first place. So when we see a flash of light at the start of life, our minds reach for the stories we've carried for centuries, stories of sparks, breaths, divine touches, and unseen arrivals. But the beauty of science is that it allows us to look beyond the first impression. It encourages us to understand not only what a phenomenon reminds us of, but what actually creates it. In the case of the spark, the explanation rests entirely within the egg. No external flame enters, no new essence descends from elsewhere. The shimmer is the egg awakening, preparing, shifting into the rhythm of life. And in a way, that is meaningful too. Imagine standing in a room that has been dark for a long time. At first, it is impossible to see what lies inside, but then someone turns on a switch and the light reveals everything: the shelves, the corners, the quiet object waiting. The zinc spark is like that moment. It doesn't add anything new to the room. It simply lets the room do what it was built to do. The egg has been holding its own potential all along, waiting for the key that unlocks its next chapter. For some, learning that the spark is biochemical might feel disappointing, as though one thread of mystery has been pulled loose. But often, understanding the mechanism deepens the wonder. Life does not require magic to be miraculous. The fact that a single cell can respond with such precision, can wake up with such clarity, is extraordinary in its own right. The spark is not the soul, but it is part of the architecture that allows a human being to exist at all. And this brings us to a deeper realization. If the soul exists, it does not rely on light to enter. It doesn't need a spark to announce itself. It would not be tied to any one chemical event. If the soul has no shape, no colour, no charge, then something as physical as a flash cannot be its doorway. The soul, if real, would be something much quieter, like the awareness that continues long after your thoughts shift, or the sense of self that remains even when you forget your own name for a moment. It would be the part of you that does not dissolve when memories fade or when emotions shift. Something steady, silent, and inexplicable. This is where the zinc spark becomes useful in another way. It teaches us what not to expect. If we hope to find the soul by catching a flash of light or a sudden glow, we are looking in the wrong place. The spark serves as a reminder that the tools we use, microscopes, cameras, dyes, are built to detect physical processes. They reveal chemicals, structures, and movements. They cannot reveal something that is not made of those ingredients. And so the question changes shape. Instead of asking, why doesn't the spark show the soul entering? We begin to ask, what should we expect the soul to look like if it doesn't belong to the world of light and chemistry? This shift is subtle but important. It moves us from searching for proof to searching for understanding. It allows us to consider that the soul might not be a thing that arrives at all. It might be something that emerges, or something that has always been present in a way we cannot measure. In ancient texts, especially the ones we will explore later in this gentle journey, the soul is described as something that does not move the way objects move. It does not arrive as a physical traveller or leave as a physical guest. It is instead a quiet constant that expresses itself through awareness. If that view is correct, then the spark is merely the egg making itself ready for a being that already contains this awareness, or will contain it when consciousness arises later in development. The spark also invites us to reflect on a deeper aspect of beginnings. Not everything meaningful happens at the first moment. A symphony begins long before the first note is heard, in the tuning of instruments, in the drawing of breath. A story begins before the first page is turned, in the ideas forming in the mind of the author. Life too might begin in layers. The spark might mark the start of biological activity, but the start of consciousness, the start of personhood, or the start of the soul, if such a thing exists, may unfold at its own time, quietly, beyond the reach of cameras and dyes. There is also a quiet humility in recognizing that even when we explain how something happens, we do not always explain why it feels profound. We know the spark is not a soul entering the egg. We know it is the release of tiny particles from the egg's surface, yet the image still resonates. It still feels like an echo of something ancient. And that feeling tells us something important, that science and meaning are not enemies. They can sit together like two people sharing the same silence for different reasons. The spark can be understood as chemistry and felt as symbolism without contradiction. It can be both a biological mechanism and a poetic reminder. What it cannot be, what the evidence does not support, is a direct indicator of the soul arriving. And understanding this frees us to look for the soul in places that make more sense, in consciousness, in awareness, in the difference between a breathing body and a still one, in the mysteries we will explore soon. In its own way, the spark invites us to keep searching, but with clearer eyes. It whispers that beginnings are beautiful, but they are not always where the deepest mysteries live. And as we follow that whisper, we begin to look toward the next question, not what the spark is, but what it suggests about the nature of your life and where our attention should turn next in the gentle search for the soul. As we leave behind the spark that begins life, we drift now toward its quiet counterpart, the final moments when life begins to loosen its hold on the body. This part of our journey feels different. The spark is sudden, bright, and full of momentum. The end of a life is slow, gentle, like a tide withdrawing from the shore. And yet, just as the beginning of life carries a shimmer that surprised scientists, the end of life carries its own subtle brightness, one that appears not in the egg but in the fading activity of the brain. To understand this, imagine standing beside someone who is nearing their final breath. The room is soft, perhaps dimly lit. Machines hum gently. The heart monitor traces its last small shapes. When the heart begins to slow, doctors and nurses know what to expect. The breathing becomes quieter. The lungs rise and fall like waves that are slowly losing strength. Then, at some point, they stop. The heart follows, its beat tapering off until it becomes a straight, silent line. These moments are familiar to medicine. They unfold with calm predictability. But the brain, the organ of thought, memory, awareness, and experience, does not go dark the instant the heart stops. Inside the skull, there are still tiny reserves of oxygen, little drops of energy that take a moment to fade. And while the heart and lungs slow in a quiet, steady descent, the brain often ends its activity in a more complex way. Instead of simply dimming, it sometimes brightens for one last moment. A brief flicker, a final ripple, a wave of rapid coordination that seems almost out of place. This is the wave that Dr. Stuart Hameroff and his team observed. 7 patients, each reaching the end of their time, each monitored carefully, not in search of a miracle, but in search of understanding. They watched the electrical rhythms in the brain shift from normal patterns to slower ones, then to almost nothing. But after the pulse and breath had stopped, after the body had begun to fall still, something unexpected happened. A sudden rise, a small bright wave of fast, coordinated activity, moved through regions associated with memory and inner awareness. To make sense of this, think of a city during a power outage. As the main electricity fails, the lights go out one by one. But sometimes, just before everything goes fully dark, a single surge runs through the grid, illuminating a few bulbs for a second before they blink away forever. The brain's final wave is something like that. It is not a return to life, not a restoration of conscious thought. It is a last stirring of circuits that have been holding themselves together for as long as they can. In scientific terms, these fast rhythms are usually called gamma waves, but that phrase doesn't mean much when we remove it from lab equipment. To imagine gamma, picture the difference between a slow rainfall and the rapid tapping of hail. Slow rhythms of the brain are like heavy drops falling steadily on a roof. Fast rhythms, the kind seen in moments of concentration or in the vivid clarity of a memory, are like tiny hailstones, tapping quickly, creating patterns too subtle to track individually. In the final wave, the brain creates one last burst of rapid tapping before the weather passes. What does this wave mean? For some neuroscientists, it may be the brain's last attempt to organize itself. As energy fades, the neurons, millions of small cells, lose their ability to stay synchronized. But before the system collapses, the remaining pockets of activity may clump together, creating a short-lived pattern that looks stronger than expected, like a murmuration of birds suddenly contracting into a tight spiral before scattering into the wind. For others, this wave might represent something more mysterious. Consciousness, as we experience it, often arises from coordinated activity across different brain regions. Memories form and emerge in moments of heightened connection. Some theorists, including Dr. Hameroff, have suggested that deep within the cells are tiny structures that might hold information in ways that are not entirely tied to the physical world. If such structures play a role in consciousness, if awareness is not only electrical but also rooted in delicate patterns within these subcellular spaces, then the final wave could be a release of that pattern, like the last echo of a bell long after it has been struck. This idea, though speculative, resonates with many who feel that consciousness might be more than chemistry alone. It suggests the soul, if it exists, is not something that moves like a physical object, but something that expresses itself through the mind and withdraws when the mind can no longer sustain the conditions it needs. The final wave becomes a whisper, a soft exit rather than a sudden departure. However, it is important to tread gently here. Science does not yet confirm that this wave is a sign of the soul. It cannot say what the patient experiences, if anything. It cannot claim that the spark at the beginning of life is purely physical in meaning, nor that the wave at the end is spiritual. The truth remains somewhere between data and mystery, and perhaps that is where this topic belongs, not in rigid conclusions but in quiet contemplation. The final wave also reminds us of the limits of our instruments. Electrodes can measure electrical signals, but they cannot measure awareness itself. They detect voltage, not presence. They trace rhythm, not meaning. When someone remembers a childhood smell, the machine sees only patterns of activity. When someone feels love, the machine sees only a shift in blood flow. The inner experience, the part that feels alive, is always hidden, always private. This is why the wave feels so haunting. It is the last trace of something internal, something we cannot fully see. It is like hearing the tail end of a lullaby after the singer has already walked out of the room. As we drift gently into the next part of our exploration, this wave becomes a turning point. It shows us that the end of life is not a simple shutting down, but a small sequence of events filled with complexity and quiet beauty. A light at the beginning, a shimmer at the end, and in between, every moment of being human. Whether these lights represent chemistry alone or hint at something deeper is what we'll continue to explore, slowly and softly, in the chapters ahead. When people first heard about that final burst of activity in the brain, after the heart had already fallen silent, many felt a shiver of recognition, as if an old story told by ancestors had been echoed by modern machines. The idea that something bright and purposeful might happen at the edge of life resonates deeply, because many cultures across time have imagined the soul leaving the body at that very moment. But to understand this event gently and clearly, we need to explore not only what science observes, but how different theories try to interpret that observation, and we must do so with the softness of someone walking across a quiet room at night, careful not to disturb the stillness around them. When the brain creates that final wave of rapid activity, one explanation is simple: it might be a kind of reflex. As the system collapses, electrical signals may gather into one last coordinated pattern before fading away. In this interpretation, the wave is not a sign of awareness returning, but a natural consequence of energy leaving. Just as embers of a dying fire sometimes flare once more when the last pieces of wood shift, the brain might produce a brief glow as its circuits dissolve. The beauty of this interpretation is its simplicity. The limitation is that it does not fully address why the wave seems to involve regions that, in life, are linked to memory, perception, and internal awareness. Another possibility, also grounded in neuroscience, is that the final wave could be the brain's last attempt to stabilize itself. Throughout life, the brain works constantly to maintain balance. It regulates temperature, hunger, breathing, emotional states, and electrical rhythms. Even in dreaming, it organizes experiences into images and stories. If the brain senses itself slipping into irreversible shutdown, it might attempt one final integration, a last effort to bring its fading parts together. This integration might appear on recordings as the bright wave. In this view, the wave reflects a closing gesture, like someone smoothing out a bedsheet before stepping away. But the third interpretation, the one that draws the most attention, comes from scientists like Dr. Hemroff, who believe that consciousness might not be entirely contained within electrical signals alone. They suggest that deep inside brain cells, there may be tiny structures capable of holding patterns of information in a way that does not rely solely on the usual machinery of neurons. These structures, far smaller than any camera can see, may act as miniature theatres where the smallest building blocks of the world play out their delicate performances. And in those performances, awareness could arise. The scientific words used to describe these ideas often sound harsh and metallic, full of syllables and symbols that feel too cold for a bedtime reflection. But stripped of their jargon, the idea becomes surprisingly gentle. It imagines consciousness as a kind of quiet pattern, a way in which tiny pieces of reality fall into harmony with one another. When everything in the brain is working, these patterns might flow smoothly, creating the experience of thought, memory, and selfhood. When the brain is shutting down, these patterns might dissolve or release, creating a last shimmer of activity as they let go of their structure. Some people imagine this moment as a kind of lifting, like the final breath of a lantern before the flame goes out and the warmth escapes into the air. Others see it as a transition, the mind easing its ties to the body. These are not scientific conclusions, but poetic interpretations, ways of giving shape to a process we still cannot fully describe. What is beautiful is that science does not forbid such interpretations. It simply cannot confirm them yet. The most important point here is one of humility. The brain is one of the most complex systems known in the universe. 1 trillion connections forming patterns, loops, and echoes, each one both fragile and immensely powerful. Even when machines can record its electrical activity, that activity is only a shadow of what the mind truly experiences. A monitor might show a wave, but it cannot show a memory. It might record the rising and falling of signals, but it cannot record the feeling of holding someone's hand, or the sound of laughter echoing across years. Consciousness is more than electricity. It is the medium through which life is felt. This is why, when faced with the final wave, many people instinctively feel that something meaningful might be happening. Science can say, here is the pattern, here is the timing, here are the regions involved, but it cannot say, here is the experience. Whether the patient is aware, whether they see images or memories, whether they sense anything at all, these things cannot be measured by wires. They remain private, intimate, silent. In this gentle space between data and possibility, theories about the soul find room to breathe. Some imagine the soul as a companion to consciousness, something that expresses itself through the brain but is not defined by it. In this view, the final wave might be similar to a bird spreading its wings before leaving a branch. Not the soul itself, but the body preparing for its departure. Others see the wave as a purely physical echo, beautiful in its own right, but no more spiritual than the glow of a dying star. Both perspectives hold truth, depending on what part of the question you listen to. There is also a practical question to consider. Even if the final wave held some deeper significance, how would we know? Our tools are limited to the physical world. They measure electricity, magnetism, and movement. They cannot measure meaning. They cannot record presence. If the soul exists, it may not leave behind anything our instruments can detect. No trail, no signature, no measurable footprint. It may simply slip away as quietly as a dream upon waking. This does not mean the soul is impossible. It means only that science is not designed to find it. A microscope can reveal the shimmer of a zinc spark, but not the shimmer of awareness. An electrode can detect the wave of a dying brain, but not the quiet sense of self that might accompany it. Our instruments are tuned to the language of matter. If the soul speaks a different language, we will not hear it through these devices. And so, theories about the final wave remain theories, some rooted in neuroscience, some in philosophy, some in spiritual reflection. None can claim certainty, but each one contributes to the same gentle truth. The border between life and death, between presence and absence, is filled with moments we do not yet understand. As we drift further into this exploration, the spark at the beginning of life and the surge at its end begin to form a quiet constellation. Two bright points appearing at opposite edges of existence, each beautiful, each mysterious, and each often misunderstood. But now the question becomes deeper, more spacious. What can science actually measure when it studies life? And just as important, what does it never measure, no matter how advanced our instruments become? To understand this gently, imagine yourself standing in a room filled with tools. Some tools weigh things, some shine light on things, some record changes in electricity or heat. These tools are marvelous. They built the world we know today: airplanes, telescopes, phones, medicine, electricity, and even the screens you're using to listen now. But these tools share something in common. They can measure only what belongs to the world of physical form. Anything that has weight, shape, temperature, movement, or measurable energy can be captured. The rest passes through the room unnoticed. Science, at its core, is a language spoken by matter. To speak that language, you must play by its rules. You must observe things that occupy space, things that change with force, things that emit light or attract magnets. If something does not live in that physical domain, science has no direct way to touch it. This is not a limitation of intelligence, it is a limitation of design. Our instruments are like nets woven only for fish. If a beam of sunlight enters the water, the net cannot catch it, no matter how skilled the fisherman is. This raises a gentle truth. If the soul is something non-physical, if it has no shape, no weight, no electrical current, then our scientific tools would never detect it. They would sense the zinc spark because zinc is physical. They would record the final brainwave because electricity is physical. But if consciousness or the soul belongs to another category entirely, something outside the grid of measurements, then expecting science to detect it is like expecting a camera to capture a scent. Even the electricity in the brain, which seems so fundamental to thought, is only a shadow of what the mind truly is. Electrodes can track the rising and falling of voltage, but they cannot track the texture of a memory. They cannot taste the feeling of nostalgia or capture the warmth of affection. These experiences happen inside awareness. Machines see only their footprints. Consider a sunset. A scientific instrument can detect the wavelengths of the light. It can measure the temperature of the air. It can record the angle of the sun. But it cannot measure the feeling of watching the sky blush from gold to lavender. It cannot quantify the hush that falls inside your chest when the world becomes a little quieter. The physical description of the sunset tells you everything about the light, but nothing about the experience of seeing it. The same is true for consciousness. Machines can measure the brain's energy, but not the mind's inner glow. They can detect the patterns that accompany language, but not the meaning you attach to a word. They can analyze the chemistry of sadness, but not the sorrow itself. So when people say the soul is beyond science, they do not always mean it in a confrontational way. Sometimes they mean something simpler. Our tools measure the outside of experience, not the inside. To make this clearer, imagine a violin. Science can analyse the wood, the tension of the strings, the vibration of the air when the bow touches. But the music, the sensation that travels from the sound into your chest, cannot be reduced to these pieces. It emerges from them, but is not made only of them. Something about the violin's voice feels like more than the sum of its mechanics, and if we tried to find the music inside the instrument using a magnifying glass, we would find only wood and string. This helps us approach the question of the soul with a softer understanding. If the soul exists, it may not be a particle or a field, something that can be isolated and labelled. It may be closer to music, something that expresses itself through the body, but is not contained by the body. When the body fails, the instrument breaks, the music stops. But the pattern of the music, the idea of it, cannot be pinned down or held in one's hand. It is not destroyed. It simply no longer has a place to play. This is why the spark at the beginning of a life and the wave at the end feel so symbolic. They are physical events that remind us of something we cannot quite articulate. A shimmer at the start, a shimmer at the end. Two bookends filled with chemistry but wrapped in meaning. Science can describe these moments with extraordinary detail, but it cannot tell us whether something deeper is happening behind them, because that deeper thing, if it exists, belongs to a realm outside the reach of cameras and sensors. We can also think of consciousness itself as a bridge. On one side is the world of matter, atoms, molecules, electric currents, chemical flows. On the other side is the world of experience, joy, memory, identity, longing, hope. The bridge connects the two, yet neither side alone explains the whole. Science studies the structure of the bridge, philosophy studies the experience of crossing it, and the soul, if it exists, might be the traveller. It may seem strange to say that something so central to our existence cannot be measured directly, but in fact this is common in science. Gravity was known long before it was measured. Magnetism was felt long before it was understood. Dark matter, which makes up most of the universe, has never been seen. Dark energy, which drives the expansion of space, cannot be detected directly. Quantum fields, the invisible ocean beneath particles, cannot be touched. All are known by their effects, not by their presence. The soul, then, if real, might belong to this family of unseen things, not a physical force, but a phenomenon recognized through what it leaves behind. Awareness, intention, identity, memory, selfhood. If so, the spark and the wave are not signs of the soul entering or leaving. They are simply reminders that the body moves through cycles of activation and release. The soul, if it is there, remains invisible, not because it hides, but because it does not belong to the realm of things science is built to illuminate. As we prepare to drift toward the next chapter of this journey, this thought lingers like a lantern burning low. Science shows us the movements of matter, but not the essence of experience, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. When we look closely at the spark that begins life, and the final wave that appears at the end, a gentle truth begins to emerge. Neither event can tell us what the soul is, because both belong to the physical world, and the soul, if it exists, may not. To understand this, we must step quietly into the nature of scientific tools themselves, not in a way that diminishes science, but in a way that respects its strengths while recognizing its boundaries. Science is extraordinary, but it is extraordinary in a particular domain. It sees everything that has weight, shape, charge, temperature, and energy. It reveals light too faint for our eyes, particles too small for our fingers, and structures too vast for our imaginations. But science does all of this inside a particular stage. a four-dimensional theatre made of three directions of space and one flowing line of time. This theatre, space and time, is where every electron, every atom, every wave and every cell exists. If something is outside this theatre, or not fully inside it, our instruments would have no way of capturing it. Not because the thing isn't real, but because our tools are designed only for the actors who follow the rules of this stage. Asking a microscope to detect something that doesn't reflect light is like asking a stethoscope to taste sweetness. The request isn't unreasonable, it's simply misdirected. To picture this more softly, imagine tuning an old-fashioned radio. You twist the dial and hear static. Then, suddenly, a melody emerges, clear for a moment, and then it fades again into noise. The radio does not say that the melody doesn't exist while the static is playing. It simply says, "I cannot hear it right now." The device is limited by its design. It captures only the waves that fall within its tuning range. Anything beyond that range slips by silently, unfelt and unnoticed. Our scientific instruments are like that radio. They are tuned to detect the vibrations of physical matter, electrical waves, magnetic fields, chemical reactions, gravitational forces. They reveal the zinc spark because zinc interacts with light. They reveal the final brain wave because electrons push through neural pathways. But if consciousness or the soul has even a single aspect that does not vibrate within the frequencies of physical reality, our tools will never detect it. Not because they are weak, but because they are precise. Precision is both their brilliance and their boundary. This is why so many debates about the soul become tangled. Some people say, if we cannot measure the soul, then it must not exist. Others say, if we cannot measure the soul, then it must be beyond science. Both statements assume that science should, in principle, detect everything that exists. But the truth is gentler. Science detects only what is built from measurable signals. Anything outside those signals cannot appear on its screens. We forget sometimes that experience itself is something science cannot measure directly. It can measure the brain activity of someone tasting chocolate, the rhythmic pulses and chemical shifts, but it cannot measure the taste. It can study the patterns of neurons firing when someone remembers their childhood, but it cannot measure the memory. It can detect the heartbeat quickening during fear, but it cannot detect the fear itself. The inner landscape of awareness is invisible to every tool we have created. This invisibility does not make experience unreal, quite the opposite. It makes experience the most immediate reality we know. You may not see your awareness, but everything you know, every colour, every dream, every moment of love or loss, passes through it, and none of it leaves a measurable trace beyond what electrical and chemical shadows accompany it. In this sense, consciousness is already partly outside the reach of scientific tools. We can study its echoes but not its core. We can map its terrain, but not the traveller moving across it. The traveller is invisible to instruments not because it is imaginary, but because its nature is different. Some philosophers and physicists have taken this idea further, suggesting that consciousness might have aspects that do not live fully within space and time. If awareness is not entirely tied to physical processes, then expecting a microscope, electrode, or sensor to detect its essence would be like expecting a compass to detect music. The domains simply do not overlap. This does not mean science is lacking. It means only that science is specialized. It was built to explore the physical world. It has illuminated galaxies, atoms, DNA, and the origin of stars. It has given us medicines that extend life and tools that ease suffering. But when it comes to the soul, something that might not have weight, shape, or measurable force, science might be silent not because the soul is absent, but because the tools are tuned to a different kind of signal. We often say that science is objective, but what that really means is that science observes things that can be repeated and measured in the same way by anyone, anywhere. If the soul exists in a form that cannot be repeated, measured, or displayed, then science cannot say yes or no. It can say only, "I do not see it." And that answer is not judgment, it is simply honesty. There is a calmness in accepting this. The soul might not belong to the category of things we can isolate or analyze. It may belong to the category of things we experience directly, like love, meaning, beauty, and consciousness. These things cannot be weighed or graphed, yet they move the course of our lives more deeply than any measurable force. Perhaps the soul is like a radio station broadcasting at a frequency our instruments cannot tune into. We sense its presence not through equipment, but through the quiet experiences that shape our inner world. Or perhaps the soul is like the background silence that allows music to exist at all, never seen, never measured, but essential. As this understanding softens into place, we are not left with answers, but with a little more clarity about the question. If the soul is non-physical, why would we expect physical proof? If the soul does not belong to the world of mass and charge, why would we expect it to show up in sparks or waves? The limits of our tools may not be flaws, they may be hints pointing us toward a realm we cannot measure, but can still contemplate with gentleness and curiosity. As we settle more deeply into the question of what science can and cannot touch, it feels natural to let another voice enter the room, not the voice of laboratories or instruments, but the voice of an older tradition. Some ideas have been carried for thousands of years, long before microscopes or electrodes existed, long before the zinc spark was captured, or the final brain surge was recorded. One of the most enduring of these voices comes from the Bhagavad Gita, a text that has accompanied people through joy, grief, uncertainty, and contemplation across centuries. It speaks softly, not with measurements, but with metaphors, describing the soul in language meant to soothe rather than quantify. In the Gita's view, the soul is not a physical object that arrives or departs in ways we can see. It is something present beneath the shifting layers of personality and thought. The text describes the soul as something that cannot be harmed or altered by anything in the physical world, not by fire, not by water, not by wind, not by weapons or decay. These lines were written long before modern physics, yet they carry a striking resonance with the idea that the soul might lie outside the reach of physical tools. One verse says that the soul cannot be cut. In modern terms, we might say that it cannot be separated into pieces or divided like matter. It cannot be sliced the way a cell can be sliced thin to place under a microscope. It cannot be broken into smaller components the way atoms can. If the soul exists, it may be whole in a way nothing physical can be, more like a field of awareness than an object in space. Another line says that the soul, Lenyambak, cannot be burned. Fire destroys material things by breaking their structure apart. Heat changes molecules and rearranges them, but the soul is said to remain untouched by such processes, as if it does not depend on structure or form to exist. In the language of the Gita, this doesn't mean the soul is resistant, like some rare mineral that withstands high temperatures. It means the soul operates in a realm fire cannot reach, the way warmth cannot melt a memory or scorch a dream. A third line says the soul cannot be moistened or dried. Water shapes the world by dissolving some things and swelling others. It enters and leaves, changing the state of what it touches. But the soul is described as something that does not change state, something that is not softened by sorrow or hardened by fear. In this vision, the soul is constant, the observing presence behind all experiences untouched by experience itself. And then there is the phrase that says the soul is inconceivable. In modern language, we might say that the soul cannot be fully imagined using physical analogies. We can describe it as light, breath, or presence. But all these descriptions are metaphors. The soul, according to this ancient text, is something the mind cannot fully grasp because the mind works by comparing, naming, and categorizing. The soul does not fit into any category. It is not matter. It is not energy. It is something else. These descriptions do not answer scientific questions directly. They do not reveal the soul the way a microscope reveals a cell or the way a telescope reveals a galaxy. But they offer something just as valuable, a conceptual framework that aligns with the limitations of physical measurement. In a gentle way, the Gita says, do not expect physical proof of something that is not physical. If you want to know the soul, you must look not at the spark or the wave, but at the quiet awareness that watches them. This perspective blends surprisingly well with the observation that scientific tools do not detect consciousness directly. They detect only its shadows, brain waves, blood flow, the firing of neurons. The essence of experience remains invisible. The ancient text's idea of the soul as unchanging and invisible mirrors the modern understanding that awareness may not be reducible to physical components alone. There is also an interesting harmony between the Gita's idea of the soul and the way many quantum physicists describe the boundary between measurable reality and the underlying rules that guide it. When particle physicists say that certain properties of the universe cannot be observed directly but can be inferred, it echoes the Gita's idea that the soul might be known through its effects, not its appearance. The text does not use the language of forces or fields, but the sentiment is similar. Some truths cannot be seen, only understood. Yet the most comforting aspect of the Gita's description is its tone. It does not demand belief. It does not insist on proving anything. It simply offers a way of seeing the soul that fits comfortably beside the recognition that scientific instruments have limits. It suggests that the soul, if real, is not fragile. It does not flicker on and off with chemical waves. It does not depend on light or electrical activity. It remains steady, like the backdrop against which the play of life unfolds. For someone searching for the soul in sparks or waves, this perspective can be liberating. You no longer need to find the soul in a flash under a microscope or in a final burst on an EEG machine. You no longer need to treat physical events as metaphysical signs. Instead, you're invited to turn inward, to observe the quiet awareness behind your thoughts, the part of you that remains present through every change, through every emotion, through every moment of your life. Perhaps the limitations of scientific instruments are not obstacles but hints. Perhaps the fact that the soul cannot be touched by heat, or cut by tools or measured by sensors is not a failure of science, but a clue that we should be listening with a different kind of attention. And perhaps the ancient descriptions are not outdated, but simply written in the language of a world that understood the difference between what can be measured and what can only be known. As we continue drifting through this quiet inquiry, a comforting thought begins to take shape. The soul is not the only thing that lies beyond the reach of our tools. The universe is full of invisible realities, forces, fields, and phenomena that scientists accept not because they have been directly seen, but because their effects are unmistakable. This is not a weakness of science, it is one of its strengths. The ability to believe in something unseen when the evidence gently insists it must exist. To appreciate this fully, imagine walking through fresh snow. You might not see the person who passed before you, but you see their footprints in the crisp white surface. The shape of the prints, their spacing, their depth, all tell you someone was there. They leave a pattern that cannot be explained away. Much of modern science is built on this kind of indirect recognition. We see the footprints, even when we cannot see the walker. One of the most famous examples is dark matter. Scientists cannot touch it, cannot hold it, and cannot shine light on it. It gives off no glow, no heat, no detectable signal. But galaxies spin in ways that make no sense unless something invisible is anchoring them, holding their stars in place. If only the visible matter existed, stars, planets, dust, the galaxies would tear themselves apart. Something unseen is providing gravity. And so scientists say, if the effect is real, then the cause must be real. They give this cause a name, dark matter, not because it is dark, but because it lies beyond their tools. A similar story unfolds with dark energy as a mysterious force that seems to push the universe apart. Observations of distant galaxies show they are accelerating away from us faster than expected. Something is driving this expansion, stretching space itself like taffy. But this something cannot be measured directly. We see only what it does, not what it is. And yet the scientific community does not reject it. They accept it because the universe behaves as though it is there. Then there are quantum fields, the invisible oceans that underlie all particles. Physics tells us that what we think of as solid matter is actually disturbances in these fields. But the fields themselves are never seen or touched. They are inferred from the particles they create. Without them, the world cannot be explained. With them, everything falls into place. What these examples show is that science has long understood a simple truth. Not all real things can be seen. Some things are known purely through their influence, a force that bends light but has no glow of its own, a field that gives birth to particles but has no shape, a pressure that expands space but leaves no fingerprint except the stretching itself. This understanding helps us step softly into the conversation about the soul. If scientists can accept the existence of invisible forces that shape galaxies, perhaps it is not unreasonable to imagine that the soul, if it exists, might also be understood through its effects, not through a flash at fertilization, not through a surge at the end of life, but through something quieter, something woven through experience itself. The effect of consciousness, for instance, is undeniable. You're aware right now, not because anyone can see your awareness, but because you feel it from the inside. No instrument can detect the glow of your thoughts. No sensor can measure the sense of I that remains whether you're joyful, tired, or afraid. And yet this sense of self is the most certain thing you know. Everything else in the world might be doubted, but the existence of your inner experience cannot be. In this way, consciousness itself behaves like an unseen phenomenon, known through its effects, not its appearance. When you feel gratitude, no camera sees it. When you understand something, no electrode records the understanding itself. When you choose, hope, forgive, create, or dream, the essence of those acts remains invisible, though their echoes may ripple through the brain and body. If we treat consciousness as a footprint, then the soul, if real, might be the traveller. The traveller may never be captured by a lens, but its movement through the snow is unmistakable. And if the soul is the underlying presence that gives rise to your awareness, your ability to think, feel, decide, and remember, then the absence of physical detection is not surprising. It would be expected. It's also worth noting that even the physical sciences rarely begin with direct evidence. Before electricity could be measured, people noticed that amber rubbed with cloth attracted tiny pieces of straw. Before gravity was quantified, people saw apples fall. Before viruses were seen, their effects spread across towns and continents. discovery often begins with hints that something unseen is influencing the world. This gentle pattern repeats in the study of the soul. Near-death experiences, memories of past lives, sudden flashes of insight, the persistent feeling of a self that remains through every change. These are hints. They're not proof in the strict scientific sense, but they are footprints pointing toward something deeper, something that shapes experience from the inside, even if it never appears on the outside. Of course, this does not mean the soul must exist. It only means that the absence of direct detection does not disprove it. If a force as vast as dark energy can hide from our tools, yet shape the universe, then a presence as intimate as the soul can hide as well. Some truths are subtle, some phenomena are quiet, some realities are not loud enough for instruments, but loud enough for the heart. In the end, the question is not whether the soul can be seen, but whether its effects are compelling enough to suggest a presence. And here science offers a humble reminder. What we cannot measure may still be real. What we cannot detect may still be part of the universe. And what we cannot touch may still touch us. There is a quiet moment at the end of every life that science has not fully learned how to describe. It is a moment that doctors witness, families feel, and nurses learn to recognize without needing to check the machines. The room becomes still in a way that is different from sleep, different from rest, different from anything that happens while a person is alive. In that moment, something essential slips away, not loudly, not dramatically, but gently, like the last breath of wind after a long summer day. What is that something? Medicine has answers for the physical process, but even when explained clearly, the deeper mystery remains untouched. The heart stops beating because the pacemaker inside it, the small cluster of cells known for sending rhythmic signals, no longer fires. Those signals depend on a flow of tiny charged particles that drift in and out of the heart's cells. When the chemical balance shifts, the flow slows, the rhythm weakens, and eventually the heart falls silent. The lungs stop because they rely on the heart's movement and the brain's signals, and the brain itself winds down because it is no longer receiving oxygen to feed its delicate circuits. These explanations are correct, but they describe the how, not the why. They explain the mechanism but leave the deeper question untouched. It's like describing how a candle goes out. The wick cools, the wax stops vaporizing, but not explaining what the flame was in the first place. We can point to the components, but the essence remains, out of reach. Imagine standing beside someone in their final moments. You can see the body, the same body that laughed, wept, hoped, and dreamed. The same hands that held others, the same voice that spoke words of love or anger or comfort. Every organ is still there. Every cell remains. The atoms that built this person have not vanished. And yet the stillness feels absolute, a kind of absence that no list of physical processes can fully capture. Science tells us the organs have stopped functioning, but the deeper experience tells us something has gone. To understand why this feels so mysterious, it can help to think in layers. The first layer is the heart stopping. That is what doctors check first, the beat, the pulse, the rhythm. When the heart no longer pumps, blood stops flowing and the body begins to cool. But then we step into the next layer. The pacemaker cells in the heart, the sinoatrial node, stop sending out their little pulses. They stop not because they decide to stop, but because the chemical conditions inside them no longer support the electrical rhythm. Their internal balance shifts. Their tiny charged particles do not move as they once did, and the cycle that sustained life breaks. But if we go one layer deeper, we find another question. Why did those chemical conditions fail at that moment? Why did the heart's timing mechanism, something that worked for decades, lose its ability to maintain balance? Doctors can offer many surface reasons: age, illness, shock, injury, exhaustion of resources, yet at some depth, the explanations end in silence. The layers peel away until you reach a point where the question changes shape, from how did the heart stop to why did life stop? For centuries, people have stood in this space of silence and wondered whether the thing that leaves at that moment is something non-physical, not the ability to pump blood, not the ability to breathe, but the animating presence, the awareness, the self, the consciousness, the I am, that seems to accompany every living person from birth until death. When that presence is there, the body moves, communicates, responds, and expresses. When it is gone, the body becomes still, not because the organs are missing, but because the organizing principle is gone. One way to imagine this is to picture a puppet and the puppeteer. The puppet is made of wood and string. The parts are all there. The joints are designed to move. The structure remains even when the puppeteer steps away. But without the guiding presence above, the puppet does not move. Not because its components lack the ability to move, but because the coordination that gives rise to motion is no longer present. Another way to imagine this is through music. A violin without a musician is still a violin. Its strings remain tight, its wood is polished, its shape is unchanged. But without the musician's presence, the intention, the timing, the touch, the violin produces no song. Something invisible is required to turn structure into expression. When the musician leaves the stage, the violin does not fall apart. It simply falls silent. The human body is far more complex than a violin or a puppet. But the analogy captures something essential. Life is not just parts, but the harmony of those parts. And when the harmony ends, something intangible seems to slip away. Modern biology describes life as organization, not just matter, but matter arranged in a particular way. Not just molecules, but molecules interacting in patterns. Death, then, occurs when the patterns break, when the synchronized dance of systems loses its timing. But even this explanation carries a deeper question. What maintains the pattern? What keeps the heart beating, the lungs expanding, the brain thinking year after year? Not the individual parts, but the system as a whole. And systems, especially ones as intricate as life, often rely on something more than chemistry alone, something that holds the pattern steady until it does not. For some, the something that leaves the body at death is consciousness. For others, it is the soul. For many, it is the presence, the awareness that makes a person feel like a person and not a collection of parts. The body without this presence is still a body, but the person, the inner experiencer, is gone. This is why sitting with a loved one at the end of life feels profoundly different from visiting someone who is simply asleep. Sleep holds potential. You know the person will wake. The presence is still there, resting behind the closed eyes. But in death, that presence is absent. Nothing in the physical body tells you this explicitly. Every organ is still in place. Every cell still contains the structures of life. And yet you feel the absence immediately, unmistakably, without needing any scientific confirmation. We can measure the organs, the chemistry, the circulation, but we cannot measure the presence. We cannot detect the inner glow that makes the body alive beyond its biology. And so, when the final breath has passed and the silence settles, we find ourselves facing a question that no instrument can answer. What leaves when life leaves? Perhaps that question has no simple answer. Or perhaps the silence itself is the closest answer we will ever receive. When we look at a human body, whether in its vibrancy or its stillness, It is easy to think of life as something held inside flesh and bone, but life is not simply the presence of matter. It is the organization of matter, the way every cell, every signal, every breath, and every memory weaves itself into a unified pattern. Matter is the wood, the strings, the metal. Life is the music. And once we begin to see life through this lens, the difference between a living body and a silent one becomes clearer, though no less profound. Imagine a grand orchestra preparing to perform. The musicians sit quietly with their instruments, the violins resting. Against laps, the flutes held loosely, the drums still and waiting. The room is filled with the potential for music, but not the music itself. Then the conductor raises a hand and suddenly the instruments awaken. Notes respond to gestures, rhythms fall into place, harmonies weave together. The orchestra becomes more than its parts, it becomes a living arrangement. Now imagine the conductor quietly stepping away. The instruments remain, perfectly intact, but the music dissolves. Not because the instruments have changed, but because the coordination that brought them to life has ceased. The human body is similar. The cells, tissues, and organs are instruments. The processes of life, breathing, thinking, sensing, hoping, are the music. In science, this idea is sometimes described as emergence, the notion that complex patterns arise from the interaction of simpler parts. A single neuron cannot think, but billions of neurons arranged in intricate networks create perception, memory, and awareness. A single heart cell cannot pump blood, but together they create a rhythm that sustains the body. A lung cell cannot breathe, but a lung full of them can fill a lifetime with air. Life is the pattern formed by these relationships, not merely the sum of their components. But what holds this pattern together? What keeps the music playing day after day, moment after moment, through joy, grief, hunger, and exhaustion? Biology says the answer lies in chemistry and physics, flows of energy, exchange of molecules, regulation of signals, and this is true. But biology also recognizes that organization itself is fragile. Break the pattern, even slightly, and the system falters. A missing beat in the heart, a sudden stop in oxygen, a disrupted signal in the brain. Any of these can unravel the delicate arrangement that keeps a person alive. This leads to a softer, more philosophical question. If life is a pattern, what happens when the pattern collapses? When the organization fades, something essential disappears. Not the atoms, they remain. Not the organs, they remain. What disappears is the coherence, the unity, the invisible principle that makes a body alive rather than still. Some philosophers call this principle the life force, but that phrase can sound too mystical for some listeners. Others see it as the integrating function, the way all processes align themselves into a single continuous experience. But for many, the simplest and most resonant word is the one traditions around the world have used for centuries: the soul. This does not mean the soul is a physical component, a piece nested between organs or stored like a secret inside the heart. Instead, it means the soul is what allows the pattern of life to express itself through the body. Just as the conductor allows the orchestra to become music, the soul becomes the thread that ties all processes into a single identity. A body without the soul, as described in this metaphor, is like instruments without a musician, present, complete, but silent. To bring this idea closer, imagine a simple flame. The wick, wax, and air are all physical components of the candle, but the flame, the flickering expression of heat and light, is something else. It depends on the wick, but is not the wick. It burns the wax, but is not the wax. It needs air, but is not the air. The flame is an event, a meeting of materials arranged in a particular way. When the arrangement changes, the flame disappears. But it would be a mistake to say the flame was merely the wick, or merely the wax, or merely the air. It was the relationship between them. Life resembles that flame. It requires matter. It requires structure. But it is not reducible to those things. When the arrangement changes, life ends. Yet we do not mourn the arrangement. We mourn the person, the presence, the awareness that shaped the arrangement into something meaningful. This is why, when we sit with someone who has passed, the absence feels larger than the sum of physical processes. The music has stopped. The conductor has left. Something invisible is missing, but unmistakably missing. This absence cannot be detected by instruments. It cannot be quantified by sensors. It is known directly, the way silence is known after a song ends. Science acknowledges this indirectly. It describes life as a dynamic state that cannot be captured by examining physical parts alone. It describes death as the collapse of that dynamic state. Yet the experience of this collapse, the sense of something essential leaving, belongs to a realm science cannot measure. It cannot measure meaning. It cannot measure presence. It cannot measure the feeling that makes a body seem alive beyond biology. And so we return to the gentle question, is the soul simply the name we give to this pattern, this organization, this unifying principle? Or is the soul something more, something that uses the pattern but exists beyond it? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They invite reflection, the kind that grows slowly, like light spreading through dawn. What matters most in this moment is the recognition that life is not a thing, but a relationship, not a substance, but a harmony, not a collection of parts, but a pattern that holds those parts together. And when that pattern ceases, something beautiful, mysterious, and deeply human departs. Whether we call it consciousness, awareness, or the soul, it is the music we miss when the instruments fall silent. As we drift into the softer territories of experience, we step gently into a landscape that lies between life and death, where the body grows quiet but the mind, strangely, beautifully, does not always follow. Near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences have been reported across continents, across cultures, across centuries. These stories appear in hospitals, on battlefields, in operating rooms, in quiet bedrooms, and sometimes in places as ordinary as a roadside after an accident. They arise from people of every age, language, and belief system. And yet, despite their diversity, these experiences share patterns that feel as steady and familiar as the rhythm of a tide. One common pattern is the sense of leaving the body behind. People describe feeling themselves rise, drift, float, or simply step out of the physical frame they have known all their lives. They often report seeing their own body from above, resting on a hospital table or lying on the ground. Some describe hearing voices, doctors, paramedics, family members, even though their physical ears were no longer functioning. These moments feel both vivid and peaceful, as though awareness has loosened from the body like a thread slipping free from fabric. To imagine this, picture yourself standing in a room that you've always known from the inside. Your perspective has always been locked behind your eyes, and suddenly, as easily as lifting your head from water, you find yourself outside that perspective, observing from a new angle. People who undergo these experiences say that vision becomes wider, clearer, and somehow not tied to the usual limits of sight. They describe seeing without eyes, hearing without ears, and understanding without the usual fog of confusion that accompanies trauma or medical emergency. This is not the same as dreaming. People who return from these experiences often say the clarity was sharper than waking life, brighter, more real. colours appear softer, but also more meaningful. They speak of a stillness that feels warm, like a presence rather than an emptiness. Another shared pattern is the sense of movement through a space that feels both enclosed and infinite. Some describe it as a tunnel, a passage filled with gentle light, not blinding, not harsh, but soft in the way dawn often is when the world has not yet decided to be loud. Others describe the movement as drifting upward or forward, carried as though on a breath. Occasionally people say they feel pulled by something not forceful but welcoming, like a hand held out in the dark. There is also the presence. People speak of encountering someone or something that feels familiar, comforting, and deeply peaceful. It is often described not as a figure but as a presence, a kind of warmth that communicates without words. Some interpret it as a loved one who has passed. Others interpret it as a divine being. Still others describe it simply as a feeling of being known completely. The presence is not something that instructs or commands. It is something that welcomes. Then comes the life review. This is one of the most striking and consistent elements across thousands of accounts. People say that their entire life unfolds before them, not as a punishment or judgment, but as a story seen from the perspective of understanding rather than regret. They see moments they forgot, moments they overlooked, moments they wish they could change, but they see them with compassion. They describe it as watching a tapestry, each thread touching another, each choice shaping another life in ways they had not realized. To imagine this, think of memories not as pictures stored in boxes, but as lanterns lined along a road. In daylight, the lanterns seem unremarkable, merely objects. But when darkness falls, the lanterns glow, revealing paths you walked without noticing. People in near-death experiences say they suddenly understand the emotional weight of their actions, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that feels like truth gently unveiling itself. What makes these experiences even more intriguing is the presence of what researchers call veridical perception. These are details perceived during unconsciousness that are later confirmed by doctors, nurses, or family members, details the person had no physical way of knowing. Some report seeing a specific tool dropped on the floor. Others recall conversations that happened while their brain activity was nearly flat. A few describe events occurring in distant rooms or even outside the hospital entirely. One well-known case involved a patient who described the unusual shape of a surgical instrument she had never seen and could not possibly have observed from her position. Another described a shoe resting on the roof of a hospital building, something confirmed later when an attendant retrieved it. These accounts do not prove the soul, but they gently complicate the assumption that consciousness is always limited to the functioning of the physical brain. Some skeptics suggest these experiences could be hallucinations created by a stressed brain. But this explanation struggles with the consistency across cultures and time, and it struggles even more with the accuracy of veridical reports. Hallucinations rarely produce coordinated stories among strangers. They rarely produce calm clarity in moments of physical crisis, and they certainly do not produce accurate descriptions of events occurring outside the person's physical range of perception. It is important to say gently, science has not concluded that NDEs prove the soul, but it also cannot explain them fully. The data is present. The stories are there, thousands of them, echoing across decades. The patterns are too consistent to dismiss. The clarity, the peace, the separation from the body, the presence, the life review, the veridical details, all these elements together create a quiet suggestion that consciousness may not be as tightly tied to the physical brain as we once thought. Perhaps NDEs do not prove the soul, but they invite us to consider something subtle. Awareness may have layers, and one of those layers might not depend entirely on biology. In a world where science already accepts invisible forces that shape galaxies, perhaps it's not unreasonable to imagine that awareness too might reach beyond the edges of the body. And so we drift softly into the next part of this journey, carrying with us these stories of people who travelled to the threshold and returned, their words gentle reminders that the boundary between body and awareness may not be as sharp as we once believed. As our exploration moves from the quiet threshold of near-death experiences into the mysterious territory of memory, we step into a space where the line between imagination and recollection becomes strangely thin. Across many cultures and decades, thousands of children have spoken of memories they should not have, memories of distant towns, unfamiliar families, unusual skills, and sometimes even violent endings. These accounts often appear between the ages of 2 and 5, before a child has learned enough about the world to invent such details with precision. And yet the details come. Names, places, relationships, objects, accidents, professions, and habits that do not belong to their current life. The work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who devoted over 40 years to studying these phenomena, collected more than 3,000 of these cases across India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Turkey, Thailand, Alaska, and many other places. His successor, Dr. Jim Tucker, continued the research, focusing especially on American and European cases where cultural expectations about reincarnation are minimal. What makes these studies remarkable is not simply the number of stories, but their specificity and the way they hold up under investigation. Imagine a child, barely able to form full sentences, speaking confidently about a village they have never visited, describing the layout of streets, the colour of houses, the names of neighbours. Parents listen, confused but curious. Then, one day, the child points to a map or mentions a place that seems oddly real. Some families decide to investigate. They travel to the location and find that the child's descriptions match, sometimes with startling accuracy. Not just the colour of buildings, but the placement of windows, the names of shops, or even the way a particular door creaks. In many cases, the child speaks about a previous family, a mother, father, siblings, sometimes even the pet or the favourite toy of their supposed former home. When researchers accompany the family to meet the people from the story, something unexpected happens. The child recognises individuals they have never seen in this life, not vaguely, but intimately, recounting personal habits, nicknames, arguments, and moments that only the former family would know. These details, if they appeared in 1 or 2 cases, might be brushed aside as coincidence. But over thousands of cases, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Some of the most compelling cases involve memories of how the child claims to have died. Children describe accidents, drownings, war injuries, or sudden illnesses with an emotional intensity far beyond simple storytelling. And in dozens of cases, the physical body of the child shows birthmarks or small deformities that correspond eerily precisely to the injuries described. A child who speaks of a gunshot wound to the chest may have a birthmark in the exact location. A child who speaks of a blade across the neck may have a pale line tracing the same path. These birthmarks are not vague or symbolic. Stevenson carefully documented them, gathering medical records from the previous individual whenever possible. In some cases, the match was so precise that even the shape of the wound was mirrored. How does a child acquire a detailed scar-like birthmark from a life they never lived? There is no widely accepted answer. Biology does not contain a mechanism for transmitting memories or injuries from one life to another, and yet the patterns appear. Of course, not all cases are equally strong. Some rely on general impressions, fragments of stories, or culturally influenced expectations. But the strongest cases, those in which the details can be independently verified, leave even skeptical researchers unsettled. The children often lose these memories by the age of 6 or 7, as if the doorway to that other life closes once their current life's identity solidifies. But the years before that closing are often filled with vivid recollections they cannot logically possess. To imagine what this feels like from inside, picture being a very small child and waking from a dream that feels more like a memory. You know the street where you once walked. You remember the scent of a certain tree near your old home. You recall how the sunlight passed through a particular window in the early morning. The memory feels yours. But when you look around, nothing matches. Your parents tell you those places do not exist in your current life, yet something inside insists they do. Some children grow distressed by this mismatch. Others accept both lives as though they were simply chapters in a longer story. Some even attempt to return to their former homes, tugging at their new parents' hands, saying, "My real house is that way." The emotional force behind these statements is striking. They are not playful or vague, they are urgent. It is important to say softly and clearly, these cases do not prove reincarnation beyond all doubt. But they also refuse to be dismissed. They exist. They are documented. They contain details that exceed what one would expect from imagination or coincidence. They raise the quiet question, what is memory, and where is it stored? If consciousness is not limited entirely to the physical brain, then memories might not be limited to it either. Perhaps memory is a kind of pattern that can persist beyond the life of the body. Perhaps it is like a melody carried in the air long after the instrument has stopped playing. Or perhaps the soul, if it exists, carries residues of previous experiences, and children, being new, open, and not yet fully shaped by the expectations of this world, are simply more able to glimpse them before the window closes. Even skeptics agree on one point. The data is there. The interpretation is what varies. Some argue that the memories come from unusual access to parents' conversations, but this does not explain cases where the child's family never met or heard of the previous one. Others propose that children overhear stories from neighbours, but this collapses under cases where the two families lived far apart, sometimes in different countries. Some suggest coincidence, but coincidences do not consistently produce dozens of accurate verifiable details. What remains, then, is a gentle puzzle, a suggestion, a whisper. Something in these stories hints at the possibility that consciousness might continue beyond a single life, not as a certainty, but as a quiet invitation to consider that the boundaries of the self may be wider than we think. And so we gather these accounts not as proofs, but as lanterns, small lights that guide us along a path where the soul is not assumed, nor dismissed, but explored with humility. Each story is one lantern. The pattern they form together is the suggestion of something beyond the physical, something that memory alone cannot explain. As we arrive gently at the final stretch of this journey, it becomes clear that the path we have taken winds through many landscapes. Tiny sparks at the beginning of life, quiet waves at its end, ancient voices from scripture, invisible forces accepted by science, the mystery of what leaves the body in death, and the strange stories of people who glimpse beyond the ordinary borders of awareness. And now, as we settle into this last reflection, the question that began our exploration begins to soften into something quieter, deeper, and more spacious. If the soul exists, where might we find it? Not in flashes or waves, but in the quiet spaces that remain after everything else has fallen silent. To understand this gently, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a forest at dusk. The day has ended, but the night has not fully begun. In that thin light, where shadows lengthen and sounds soften, everything feels more contemplative. You become aware not of details, but of presence, the hum of insects, the faint smell of earth, the whisper of wind shifting through leaves. Nothing announces itself loudly. Everything is there quietly. The soul, if it exists, might feel like that. Not an object among objects, but a presence that holds experience together like the soft fabric beneath a quilt. As we have seen, the zinc spark at fertilization, beautiful as it is, does not serve as proof of the soul entering the body. It is a chemical shift, a shimmering response to activation. It demonstrates readiness, not arrival. And the final surge of brain activity at the edge of death, alluring as it may be, does not serve as proof of the soul departing. It is a final whisper of a system winding down, a bright echo rather than a door opening. These events, while striking, belong firmly to the physical world. They tell us what bodies do, not what souls are. Yet this does not diminish the mystery. If anything, it deepens it. For what remains unexplained is not the spark or the wave, but the simple fact that there is something it feels like to be alive, something it feels like to be you. Consciousness, presence, awareness, whatever name we choose, is the quiet centre of experience, untouched by microscopes and unaffected by measurements. It is the one thing no instrument can detect, but every living person knows intimately. Science reveals the rhythms of the brain, but not the brightness of awareness. It can describe the electrical activity behind a thought, but not the thought itself. It can trace the chemistry of emotion, but not the feeling of emotion. And it can measure the moment the body stops functioning, but it cannot measure the moment presence disappears. That boundary, the fading of the inner world, is known only from the inside. Perhaps the soul is simply a name for that inner world, or perhaps it is something even deeper, the silent observer behind thoughts, the witness behind memory, the stillness beneath every emotion. The ancient texts describe the soul as invisible, unchanging, and beyond harm. Modern science describes consciousness as something that cannot be reduced to its physical components. In their own ways, both point toward the same mystery. There is a part of us that eludes measurement. What makes this mystery so profound is that it manifests not in rare events, but in every moment of life. When you close your eyes, there is still a you who sees darkness. When you wake from a dream, there's still a you who remembers the fading shadow of that world. When you laugh, cry, hope, or fear, there is always an experiencer behind the experience. No instrument can detect that experiencer. It is known only through living. This brings us back to the soft idea that perhaps the soul cannot be proved or disproved using physical tools. Perhaps the soul is not a thing that appears in space and time, but a presence that allows space and time to be perceived at all. It may not be found by looking outward, but by looking inward, into the quiet, observing awareness that has been with you from your first memory to this very moment. Near-death experiences, reincarnation stories, and countless accounts of profound presence all offer hints. Not proofs, just hints. A suggestion that consciousness may not be bound entirely to the body. A gentle nudge toward the possibility that awareness might continue, like a traveller stepping from one room into another, leaving behind the instruments, but not the music. Imagine a candle that has burned low. When the flame flickers out, the wick remains, the wax remains, the holder remains, but the light, the glow that filled the room, has vanished. And yet, you do not think of the flame as destroyed. You think of it as something that lived in the meeting of wax, heat, and air. Something that was not the materials themselves, but the expression of their unity. The soul, if real, may be similar. Not a substance, but the luminous presence that arises when life is organized, and that retreats when the organization dissolves. Or think of a book. The pages, the ink, the binding are all physical, but the story, the part that moves you, does not exist in any single molecule. When the book is burned, the story is gone from that physical object. But the story itself, as meaning, can live in memory, can be written again, can be told in other voices, can be carried into new forms. Something intangible persists. So what remains when all else falls silent? Not the body, that returns to the world it came from. Not the thoughts, they dissolve like mist. Not the emotions, they fade with the circumstances that shaped them. What remains, perhaps, is the quiet presence we never quite know how to describe. The witness, the awareness, the soft inner glow. Whether we call this consciousness, soul, or simply the one who knows, it may be the most enduring part of what we are. And now, as we draw this gentle journey to a close, allow yourself to drift comfortably into reflection. Perhaps the soul is not something science will ever find by shining brighter lights or building finer instruments. Perhaps it is something found only by listening to the silence behind thoughts, to the awareness beneath experience, to the feeling of being alive. And whether your eyes are open or growing heavy with rest, know that the mystery of that presence is not something to solve, but something to feel. What animates you may be quieter than light, deeper than electricity, and older than any story the universe has ever told. And in that quiet, even without answers, there is something profoundly peaceful.